All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Get to talk to Isaiah Gooley again here, who I know from Mixed Mental Arts, and he's a musician and really knowledgeable about topics like economics, linguistics, politics, and history. And yeah, why don't you just tell everyone a little bit about yourself there, Isaiah?
Hello, I'm Isaiah. I read books. You can too.
Yep. So yeah, we're gonna talk about today, I guess, economics and language families, or maybe just use those as jumping off points, and we can talk about anything really. Um, I guess I guess first I just wanted to talk about, I know you're not an expert on language families in particular, but I remember I was really interested when I talked to Hunter on here when he was telling me about language families, and that got me interested in learning the Romance language families instead of just particular languages that I was learning before, like Spanish. And then now, instead of learning Italian just as a separate language isolated from the other ones within that family, I'm kind of learning that like along with the other ones in the family. So what are your thoughts on the whole idea of language families and that kind of thing?
Well, language families are useful as a descriptive manner to classify different languages and dialects into more um, analytical taxonomies, essentially. So you can put Romance languages traditionally the way that people look at the big four Romance languages is there's Italian, French, Spanish, and Ro- uh, Romanian. Um, Not Romani, but Romanian. Those are the big four that often get cited as being the key Romance languages. However, um, knowing the history of languages is as important as knowing what these language families are broken up into, and that's why classifying things as language families isn't necessarily the best way to understand descriptive linguistics because there are other methods through which languages evolve, right? So, within what we understand as the Romance languages are basically languages that developed out of Vulgar Latin um, during the era of Christendom, essentially. Um, and prior to that as well. To the extent that the Roman Empire expanded, there were people speaking Latin in those areas as a lingua franca to conduct their daily business. And after some time, that lingua franca meshed with their native languages and the languages of their neighbors and changed based on their geography. And that's how languages work in general. And because of the way that languages work, you have different ways that languages develop. And you have things like what is known as a sprachbund, which is language mixing. And that's what you get in like the East Asian cultural sphere, where you have Sino-Korean representing some large amount of the total Korean lexicon, even though uh, Korean is not a Sino-Tibetan language. So the extent to which language families are useful is dependent on a lot of different factors. So within the confines of the Romance languages, it's useful, but within the confines of other languages, it's not as useful.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting. I didn't know that. So, um, so like, would you say like what are some of the popular Romance languages that you would say that it's like pretty much completely useless, or even or at least almost completely useless to look at them as language families?
Well, within Romance languages, all languages have the same amount of use. I mean, to say something's useful or not is kind of, I don't think necessarily what I meant when I said understanding things so far as language families, specifically within the Romance languages, because
Okay.
each language has its own use to the people who speak it. That's different. As a second language learner or an adult language learner, um, the calculus that you have to make is quite different. So you're not looking at like if you want to learn multiple different languages, what you want to look at are lexicon and grammar, essentially. So vocabulary and grammar. Within the Romance languages, the grammar and the lexicon for like Italian, French, and Spanish are all very similar.
Yeah.
Like there's a lexical match of some 80 to 90% between the three. The difference between those those languages lies in phonetics. So that's where you have to really learn the differences, because the grammar's very similar between all three of those languages. So that's one consideration. But at the same time, you have languages like Chinese and Tibetan, which are in the same language family, but the lexicon is very different because of the different influences over time on those languages. And in the same way, you have Chinese Mandarin, which is different than Cantonese Chinese, which is different than Tibetan. And then there's whole linguistic debates about what other languages would belong to the Sino-Tibetan language family. So to that extent, as a scholar approaching language from a third party standpoint, understanding things as language families is only as useful as the application that you're trying to pursue. So if you're trying to learn a second language, it doesn't really matter. Language families don't really matter if you're only trying to learn one other language. If you're trying to learn multiple languages, typically it's easier to learn languages within a specific language family. But that kind of breaks down the farther away you get from Europe, because most of the scholarship in linguistics over the past 150 years has been done in Europe with the Eurocentric mindset.
Okay. So I chose to start learning language families for one of those reasons that you said, like just to learn the language as a second language. And it's interesting that I coincidentally chose the one that you say is the best to do that with for that particular purpose. But if I want to in the future, for example, learn other different sets of language families, like since I'm just like an average bro, and I'm like, the most I would do is probably maybe travel at some point and try to use like simple vocabulary in that particular language. Would you say that if I want to do that just in terms of learning multiple languages, language families would still be a useful way to do it for that particular purpose?
So when you get to that point, if your goal is traveling and you want to travel and do things in places, and that's your goal, then all this nonsense about language families falls off, because
Okay.
survival language is completely different than trying to master a language. And as an adult language learner, you're probably not going to master whatever language you approach.
Yeah.
Period. End of story. It's like it's a cognitive thing. It's a neurological thing. So based on the science that has been presented thus far, people's language learning window closes at around 13 to 16 years old. So the ability of an individual to completely copy a language, complete with grammar and lexicon, wholly and completely, um, ends within that window of 13 to 16. If you have experience with second language learning prior to that, you have a greater likelihood of getting more language after the fact, but still you're not going to speak it at a native level.
Oh,
Typically.
okay.
Typically. However, if your goal is to travel, you don't need to speak language at a native level.
Right.
This is my rule of thumb with learning basic language for traveling purposes. All you need to know how to do is order a beer, order food, hit on women, and get a hotel.
I know how to
Maybe
do
hail a
that in
taxi.
Spanish.
Maybe hail a taxi.
Yeah.
That's it. That's all you need. And I'm being, it sounds flippant, but I'm completely serious. Like if you know how to order a beer, know how to get food, know how to get a place to stay, know how to hit on women, you're good to go. And luckily, being an English speaker, most people know how to speak English around the world.
Oh, okay.
So you should be fine. Like trying to learn a language is one thing. Like I spent many years as a professional translator, right? So the comp the depth to which I had to master my second language or third language was much deeper than somebody who's trying to have a conversational existence within that language. Because you don't need to know how to explain, you know, orbital physics in Spanish in order to live a life in Spanish.
Yeah.
So, like, lower your expectations.
Right. Yeah, of course. So so that's interesting. So like for example, you were talking about development and it like the opportunity for it being like the equivalent of your first native language, ending at age 13 to 16, and
That
the
is what the science has shown thus far. Whether or not
okay.
that's true or not, I can't say, but this is what is there are several instances of studies that have been conducted, and John McWhorter is a good resource in this realm, so far as his lexicography and work on Creoles. And there's also a documentary that came out some 10-15 years ago, regarding people who have not had language exposure in their childhood and early adolescence, not being able to use language to its full extent.
Okay. I was just bringing that up because so do you think like for me, for example, actually it would be good to compare two really close parallel examples here. So like for me, for example, because I live in Canada, part of the public school system is that you if you're in a school in an English language, generally French as a second language is taught. So I was taught French as a second language all throughout elementary school and high school. But then my brother, he actually was in French immersion all throughout school, so he was bilingual throughout all 12 years of school. So would you say that like I'm not making any claims about my French ability at all because I know I remember like probably like a very small percentage of the French that I actually learned in school. But would you say that that sort of experience might help someone like me, and particularly for me with my brother, it obviously would be a lot more, for example?
Of course, any exposure to a second language or third language or fourth language is going to assist you in your cognitive processes vis-a-vis learning a language. Like this is one of the things that affected me when I was learning Chinese, is that when I first started learning, um, my anytime I would reach for a language not English, I would end up trying to go to Spanish first, and then once I assimilated Chinese more, whenever I'd reach for a second language, I would always land on Chinese. So it would be interesting to see a study regarding the cognitive processes that surround language production, not necessarily language learning, but language production.
Like
Insofar
writing?
as no. Writing is kind of language. Um, Language as we live and breathe is what we produce with our mouth,
Oh,
essentially.
okay. I see what you mean.
So like if I go to a store and I'm trying to order something to eat, whenever I go for a second language, typically nowadays it's more mixed, because I have experience with several different languages, and sometimes when I reach for a second language, it'll come out in 4 or 5 different ways, and it's confusing to everybody but me. Um, but I would be interested in seeing research as to where like non-native language is stored in the brain, if that is such a thing. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
where your repository for second language and third language words and grammar. Because I've definitely done grammatical things in English using a second or third language. I've definitely done lexical things with like trying to order something at a store and using a like a Chinese word instead of a Spanish word when I wanted to use the Spanish word.
That's interesting.
So, but I don't know if that's, you know, isolated to me or if it's a neurotypical thing. So,
So you
I mean,
think that's
that's the thing about language, man, is that language is there's so much philosophical uh fucking circle jerking going around with what language is and how language is processed, that it's hard to really say this, that, or the other about what language is per se. And like the the academic way that it's approached is that only humans can use language because language is an abstraction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And anything that animals do is not language, it's merely communication. So
yeah,
it's
that's
it's hard
interesting.
to say it's hard to say exactly what language is, even with all the scholarship that has been done about it. And like where like venerated scholars land on the topic is still up for discussion. Like even Noam Chomsky with his universal grammar, that's still hotly debated within linguistic circles.
I was gonna ask you
It's
about that.
super
Yeah.
nerdy. Like
It's Fox like the FOXP2 gene, right?
FOXP2 exists in other primates too. That's one of the issues within it. Like
And it's also connected to like a lot of other different sorts of behaviors or like brain
exactly.
processes, isn't it?
So here's one of the key aspects of human biodiversity is that most traits that humans display, including language, are polygenic, which means that they have multiple genes that express one trait, like your hair color. Your hair color is consistent and constituent of multiple different genes coalescing in a certain arrangement in order to create the proteins in a certain manner that generates your hair in the shape and color that it comes out your head in.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think I wrote a blog before about the FOXP2 gene for exactly that same sort of reason. Like I had just kind of, before I looked into it at all, just assumed, like probably a lot of people too, that, oh, Fox P2, that means that every human actually does have a universal grammar structure. But then if you actually learn even a little bit about it, it shows exactly what you were saying there,
Well,
that like genetics is a lot more complex than that.
Chomsky's argument for universal grammar is not as superficial as just looking at genetics, and that's part of the reason why it's stuck around for so long, because it has more evidence beyond the realm of mere genetics. Right?
Yeah, I'm not saying we should throw out the theory.
So, universal grammar is the best explanation as to why humans have language in the manner that they do.
Okay.
Right?
So what are the other reasons for that then?
What do you mean?
Like the other reasons that you mentioned, because I don't remember off of the top of my head, because it was a while ago that I researched this. Like does he make arguments other than from the perspective of genetics for it, like anthropology or something like that?
Yeah, he makes anthropological arguments. He makes molecular biological arguments, and he makes physiological arguments as well, like the way that your trachea is shaped, etc. And all those coalesce into basically a grand theory of language.
Okay. It's interesting that you mentioned humans in comparison to animals too, right? Because like a lot of animals, like I've heard about dolphins and other primate species and stuff like that, have what could be defined as languages, defined depending on how you define
So the
language,
reason
if
why
they're
they're not
not.
defined as languages is because, as so far as we can understand, there's no abstraction within them.
Okay.
And that's the differentiation between language as we understand it to be and communication as is observed in the animal kingdom. Like an animal can communicate a specific idea about something at a given point in time, but without the, like, a key aspect of universal grammar is this concept of recursion. And recursion is being able to basically expound upon an abstract idea. Like, you're in a screen wearing a hat with hair and a white shirt in a room with a broom on the side, etc., etc., etc. And I could go on and on and on about like your situation, and I could express like my feelings regarding um how you are presented in this frame that I'm seeing you in. And those are things that have not been observed to occur within the animal kingdom, as it were.
Okay.
So
So
without
they
those
don't.
aspects of recursion and abstraction, you don't have language, is what the prevalent or pervasive notion is within linguistics.
Okay. So like other like species other than Homo sapiens are not as good as observing as much of the particular type of detail that we're
I
used
think
to.
the specific term that people like to use is non-human animals.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, like there are obviously lots of things that make humans unique in comparison to other species, but then there are other things that make us similar, and it's the things that make us different that make us classified as a different species, I guess, right?
Well, that's how speciation occurs.
Yeah.
And within these confines, like I think that there's so much emphasis put on what makes humans unique, vice what makes humans animals, essentially. And I think that's detriment to the entire scholarship regarding human biology, and that's my own personal opinion regarding the matter.
What do you mean?
Because there's so much within the history of science and the history of anthropology that is looking to cast humans as uniquely advanced or uniquely this, that, or the other.
Oh, you mean like you throw out the, like, get rid of the reminder that we are still an animal?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with you about
Well,
that.
that's part of the tradition that, like, because so much of science has grown up within the Western cultural sphere, um, the Eurocentric cultural sphere, and not even Eurocentric, because it's definitely something that grew up in the subcontinent of India as well.
Oh,
The
really?
Oh yeah, the human centric idea of being is something that's it's almost universal within agriculturalized cultures around the world, and
Oh, okay.
it's something that's occurrent within like Chinese thought and Indian thought, and around the world.
Oh, okay. So that's interesting because I thought that was more of like a Western idea, but that's interesting that it's
The
more
Western idea
universal.
is of the progressive notion of history more so than the separation of man from nature, because like the separation of man from nature is a constant with throughout cultures, so it seems, throughout agriculturalized quote unquote civilized cultures,
Okay.
those who have left nature.
Okay. Well, I guess it makes sense that like that the first different civilizations all across the world would develop that kind of like almost egotistical view about themselves as a species for when they switch from agriculture to, well, when they switch to what we define as like more modern societies, I guess.
I hesitate on using any terms such as civilized or modern, which is why I was hedging so much, because definitions therein automatically carry a moralistic connotation,
Yeah.
and
Oh, I wasn't
the
moralizing about it.
connotations are not necessarily beneficial in understanding the world in which we live.
I totally agree. Yeah. That's one thing that bothers me about like a lot of public intellectuals within our culture. And I used to buy the line of thinking a lot more too, that what you were talking about, this kind of Western bias of assuming that history keeps progressing and becoming better and better, and our civilizations are becoming better and better in every way. But I mean, it depends on how you look at all of those definitions. And there's some that's one thing I liked about that book Sapiens that we did a mixed mental arts book club chat on recently, about how it talks about, and Chris Ryan talks about this in Sex at Dawn too, about how there were pros and cons to pre-agricultural societies like hunter-gatherer societies, and there are pros and cons to agriculture too. It's not all like one or the other.
Yeah, well, the problem that I had with Sapiens is that it had a very westernized progressive mindset in its presentation, like that before was uncivilized and violent, brutish, nasty, and short, and modern life is much more cushy, etc. And whether or not that's true is, based on one's own values. But at the same time, like, the people who lived in the past and lived lives not unlike our own, and they had feelings not unlike our own, and they got by in much the same way as we get by today. So there are advantages to our modern life, and there are disadvantages to our modern life.
Totally.
And to say that one is better than the other or one is more advanced than the other with a value judgment therein is disingenuous, because you cannot understand the psyche of people who have lived in the past,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is what presents the problems that we find ourselves in trying to understand the past.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Like, I don't remember the exact number, but I think humans haven't changed that much biologically at all, and within, like, I think something like maybe at least the last 100,000 years or something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
300,000 is
300,000. Okay,
the
but
latest
like our
is what the
worlds
latest
and our
hypothesis is.
okay, okay, 300,000. But like our worlds and our cultures have changed a lot. That's what.
Have they though? That's the real question,
Yeah,
because the extent to which our cultures have changed from what they were in the past is definitely up for debate, because the reality of what we know of the past is that the majority of people prior to the early 19th century were illiterate and could not write. So we do not know anything, hardly anything, of the lives of the majority of humanity prior to the early 1900s. And even then,
yeah.
still the majority of humans on the earth were illiterate. It wasn't until the mid 20th century until literacy became more a majority trait that people held. So,
That's an important point. Yeah. That's like
so,
hardly any of human history too.
and that's one of the great endeavors of social history, is trying to understand how people lived prior to today, right? Not necessarily understanding, when great battles happened or when great leaders, lived and died. It's trying to understand the lives of the people of the past. And because of the literacy problem, the extent to which we understand fully the lives of the people of the past is obfuscated, because all we can understand of the past is what people have recorded. And if there's no records of the past, then we can't understand the past. So most of history, most of philosophy regarding human nature is a guess, because we don't
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
how people lived or what they thought.
Yeah, that's an important point. That's like and most of history, especially as you go back farther, like you said, it's like it's written by the few people who could read and write and stuff like that. And so obviously, like you were saying, they represent a small minority of the population.
Yeah.
And oh, that's one thing I like about like historians like Thaddeus Russell, who I know we both like, because like for example, his book, The Renegade History of the United States, it focuses on history from the perspective of like the actual common people rather than these people
Well,
who
it's a
wrote the
social
history.
history. And like there's tons. What makes renegade history very compelling is the fact that it takes a social history not from a socialist perspective, not
Yeah,
looking at not looking at necessarily workers and their stripe, because like the first social history that you'll read, like chronologically, is Das Kapital, which is essentially a social history of humans living in feudalist Europe. And
that
like there
was
was so
Marx
much.
and Engels,
Yes.
right?
And there were, within that, like there was, I find it so funny as a East Asian scholar that like one of the greatest issues that Marx had run up to in his scholarship was the East Asian mode of production, and the largest communist or Marxist country today is the People's Republic of China. So
I didn't know that about Marx. That's
well,
interesting.
you should read more, sir.
I should. I'm reading all the time, but I never never can read enough. It's not possible. Like every week I'll get like at least a dozen new book recommendations, and I can only read so many books per week.
Ain't no rest for the wicked.
Exactly. Okay. So I guess I can't think of any more questions related what we were talking about. I had more questions, but then we went off into so many other different directions. Maybe I'll remember them though. But yeah, we could talk about economics now then if you want to. I wanted to ask you, because you're much more knowledgeable about this in general than me. There was I think I sent you a message a long time ago about this one this economist that was recommended to me by Mark Benjamin, who I think was talking to you on one of the economics chats, about this economist named LaRouche. And I watched some of his videos, but he was and like the people involved with his organization, but they were going off in so many different directions that I knew almost nothing about, that I just got I just got to the point where I often get sometimes where I just think, okay, this all sounds like really fascinating theories, but I know so little about all of these topics that I don't know who's right and who's wrong. And then I looked up this economist LaRouche, and it said he was like a more right wing interpretation of economics or something like that. So are you familiar with him and that
Nope.
type of economics? Oh, okay.
Well, I'm familiar with right-wing economics. The
Okay.
question is whether or not you have specific things that you want to talk about.
Well,
Like, because I don't care if somebody's right-wing or left-wing, it's whether or not their idea, cuts the mustard.
I agree. Okay, so want to just talk in general a little bit then about maybe the differences between what right-wing economics is commonly seen as, and
No.
okay. Well, what
Because here's a problem within the Anglosphere political discourse, is that left wing and right wing tend to mean not a whole lot of anything, especially in the United States, because you have right wingers who are basically anarchists who advocate for a devolution of all concentrations of power, and you have left wingers who advocate for the same. And the difference is within their ideas of how society should be structured. So, like, the whole question of whether or not something's left wing or right wing in the United States and the Anglosphere writ large is so like muddled that it's impossible to discern whether or not something is this, that, or the other. So present an idea and address it on its merits. That's the only way that you can really address anything in politics in this world that we live in as people who live in the United States or Canada.
Yeah. Well,
because nothing's left wing or right wing. Something's a political fucking, angle for this group or a political angle for that group.
That's why like subjects like economics and innumerable other ones getting so influenced by political lenses bothers me so much, because like I don't know who to believe, because I haven't learned enough about economics yet. So like, for example, I've argued with particularly political left-wing people who were just saying that, like, scientifically left-wing interpretations of economics make more sense, and I don't know entirely what they mean. And
that's
then
a vapid statement. That's not making not an argument. Like if somebody was arguing that a quote unquote leftist perspective on economics is more persuasive, they would say, oh, you know, the holding of resources by a few is detrimental to the political goals or the economic goals of the many, because it stifles the amount of resources that could be used for this, that, or the other.
Okay. So is that an idea that is particularly seen as left-wing in comparison then, since you mentioned it as
I would
an
say that
example?
it's more left-wing to say that the holding of economic assets or the means of production by the few versus being held by the people who add value to the production chain is a left-wing perspective.
Okay.
In the broadest sense.
Well, okay, so how valid of an idea would you say that is just as an economic idea?
I don't care.
Okay.
I literally don't care about the
No, I mean like
theoretical
from an
ideas
economic
regarding the means.
perspective, how effective do you think that is in general? I mean,
I don't care. And that's exactly the point, because it doesn't matter what I think things should be structured as for my life.
I'm not asking about the way you think it should be structured. I'm asking about how effective you think it is or isn't. That's all.
That's a value judgment, and the only value judgment that one can make is whether or not it'd be more conducive to their own life. So anytime somebody says, oh, you know, people should act this way, or this government would be better for everyone, or this makes more sense for me, or this makes more sense, period, they're saying this is conducive to my interests.
Of course.
That's what they're saying. It's not this makes sense or this is good. This is, you know, a moral win. It's saying, what they're saying is that I believe in this because it is conforming to my beliefs or it is in line with my interests. That's essentially what they're saying. Whether or not they're going to put it in that language, you can analyze it in that way. Because like even somebody who says that, like, why would we not want unions? Unions are a traditionally left-wing ideal. Why would we not want unions? They empower people to, you know, make money off of their labor in a conducive manner. Why would we not want that? Somebody would say because it stifles entrepreneurship and it puts a more burden on small business owners to meet the prevailing wage of said profession. And they're looking at it from a lens of somebody who is a potential business owner themselves and not as a potential worker. So it's a value judgment as somebody who views themselves as a potential entrepreneur or business owner, saying unions are bad because they stifle the ability of people who own businesses to capitalize on their business as such. That's the argument that is most commonly presented against the idea of unions. Now, whether or not unions are good or bad is up for debate in ways that are not necessarily within that line of reasoning. Like, there are arguments that somebody who is a worker, quote unquote worker, could make against unions. But the most common right wing answer to unions is that it stifles business. And that to me is not an empirical judgment, it's a value judgment. Now,
yeah,
all these link back into what is the goal of the economy. And that is a that is a question that I'm not necessarily prepared to answer. What is the goal of an economy? Because I don't really care about what happens to the economy writ large. Insofar as I know what I want from my economic activities, and I know what is possible within the world that we live in. And I know that my values do not hold fast to either a right wing or left wing view. So when I say I don't care about whether or not a left wing or right wing view of economics is good or bad, whatever, that's what I mean. It's like nothing's good or bad for me. It's what I can exploit for my own benefit.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Well, that's why I kind of try to take that same sort of perspective too. And that's why I'm annoyed when people try to offer like perspectives from a right wing or a left wing or a libertarian perspective. But and well, like let's take a particular idea like trickle down economics for example. Like what do you think about that?
I think it's a fucking bunk theory of economics that doesn't work.
Okay, I've heard that before, and I find that fairly convincing too. But what are the reasons that you think that?
Because the nature of capital is that capital ends up coalescing within the hands of a few and stays there. And like the fact that there are billionaires within the economy is a detraction on production writ large, because that money is sequestered from further development. And that's an argument from a right-wing perspective against right-wing economics.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good way of putting it too. Okay.
So the internal contradictions within the economic views or the economic approaches of the left and the right wing are so apparent that it's hard to say that the left or right wing is better or worse than the opposite.
Yeah, it seems that way, just generally speaking, from a political perspective in general too, which is why like I also don't don't like the idea of any one particular political ideology or any particular ideology in general, and I try to avoid adopting one completely, because one
So
perspective can be better for some decisions than other perspectives.
so Andrew, this is the point in the conversation where I'm going to start being a dick to you. So I just want to warn you beforehand. But when you say you avoid ascribing to a certain political ideology, what I hear based on my experience with you is that you do not have either the experience nor the background to tell what is verifiable or legitimate or useful from what is the opposite of those.
What do you
So
mean?
within the realm of whom you see as thought leaders or intellectuals who can form a cohesive political position or a ideological position or a overall philosophical standpoint, you seem very lost within those aspects. And
What do
it's
you
not
mean?
necessarily that you have strong convictions or that your strong conviction is that you want to be open to these other things. It's that you're so weak in your convictions that if anything has a semblance of veracity, you might accept that idea as being tenable.
I don't understand what you mean.
So within the realm of, say, Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris or whomever, whichever thought leader or intellectual or pseudo-intellectual or polemicist, etc., I feel like you have a tendency to evaluate individuals on a very generous criteria.
Okay.
You're not
I
judicious
do that
with your,
deliberately.
I understand that. And the deliberate nature of your thought process is not something that I would like. I wouldn't say that any of your thought processes are necessarily detrimental to your overall philosophical development or your overall intellectual development. But I would say that understanding where somebody is coming from and the context in which they present their ideas is just as important as understanding the ideas that they present.
I make that point myself all the time.
And yet, I have noticed a tendency of you to extol the ideas of those whose context is not necessarily the most on the up and up, as it were.
Well, what do you
Not in good faith.
for what
I
thing?
would
What do you mean
characterize
by on
Jordan
the up and
Peterson.
up, and why do
I would
you have a better
characterize Jordan
perspective
Peterson, Ben
on the up
Shapiro
and
et
up
al.
than anyone else?
I would characterize certain individuals within the intellectual blogosphere or the intellectual internet as being bad faith actors.
I wouldn't describe them that way. Why would you describe them that way?
Because I think that certain intellectuals within this realm are bad faith actors because of either their own political ideology and the desire to win at arguments versus trying to find an individualized or even a generalized philosophical truth. And because they're not trying to strive for greater understanding themselves and rather pushing in their own ideology,
I think where
even if their arguments are on their face fallacious and in bad faith in the nature in which they present them, I think that discourse is a detriment to anybody who's trying to learn anything.
Okay. Well, it's okay. So for one thing, to me, it kind of seems like you have stronger convictions than I do, and because I don't have as strong of convictions as you do, you think it's better to have stronger convictions. And that sounds like moralizing to me for one thing, which I don't like to do, and it seems like you also don't like to do. And for another thing,
I'm not trying to moralize per se. And what I am trying to say is more fundamental than criticizing your convictions, as it were. What I'm saying is that there's in the art of war, one of the key concept is Jurji Jurbi, which is know the other and know yourself, right? If you don't know who you are, then you cannot know anyone else. And if you don't know anyone else, then you can't understand yourself.
Does anyone truly know who they are?
That's the goal.
That's a good goal, which
That's the goal, is to try to understand oneself. And that's like the intellectual endeavors of us all, right? We're trying to understand who we are as humans or as thinkers, etc., etc., etc. We're trying to understand what it is and where we are in the world. And because so much of the political discourse within specifically the Anglosphere is a retread of the past. If you don't know the past, then you're going to be susceptible to things that have been argued against and debunked in the past.
Okay,
like within the realms of these intellectuals on the internet.
Okay, so like in terms of like members of the so-called intellectual dark web who you mentioned, like a good example of what you were just talking about in terms of my own experience is that, for example, like a lot of people I still know now, I would agree with a larger percentage of what people like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson say. But then, in large part to like people like you in mixed mental arts and whatnot, I started learning about a lot of different ideas from different perspectives. For example, I started actually learning about postmodernism instead of just buying Jordan Peterson's line about it based on no evidence whatsoever. And then since then, I've learned more about these things, and then I say like, okay, so I like some of what some of these guys are doing, and I agree with some of what they say, but then this over here, I don't like this part and criticize a lot of what they say because, like, for example, they use a lot of philosophical labels interchangeably that really make no sense at all, and they're supposed to be these like well-read intellectual guys who clearly have not researched at all some of the things that they criticize. So I try to just be basically just as intellectually honest as possible and to try and prove myself out.
That's what bad faith intellectualism or bad faith argumentation is taking a position
How does
without
that make any sense?
It's taking a position without knowing the the position that you're drawing up against. It's a classic straw man.
So no, it's not. You're saying that
The whole idea
it sounds like you're saying that no one should say anything unless they've done like intense study.
That's absolutely not what I'm saying, because like all these intellectual ideas are actually very superficial. The idea that people's subjective experience is more informative of how they view the world than what science says is common sense.
It's not common sense to a lot of people, though.
It is, though, because that's what you hear from people in the streets every day. And like the idea that the way that people live influences how they act in the world is common sense.
Yeah, but people, I think anyway, tend to not apply this to like science, for example, that you mentioned, because we have this like idea in our culture of propping up science as being superior, I think.
There is an aspect of culture who does that. And that's the aspect of culture that you absorb on a day-to-day basis as somebody who attends a university. However, most people who go to bars at night, most people who go to church on Sunday don't live that reality. And that's what I'm getting at, is that the reality
I'm still confused about what you mean by being a bad faith actor then.
Because somebody who professes themselves to be an intellectual
Oh, you
should
mean like,
not
okay.
should not make an argument against another form of intellectualism without understanding what they're attacking.
Oh, you mean like the examples I brought up, like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson criticizing postmodernism
Well,
and
the problem
saying
with Sam
terms like,
Harris is that Sam Harris is basically a eugenicist. And the
no, he's
problem with
not.
yeah, he is.
No, he's not.
And the problem with Jordan Peterson is that he's essentially a Western chauvinist.
How? It seems like these are massive oversimplifications of all of what they do to me.
I understand why you would say that. And like there's numerous resources regarding what people construe as the West or what people construe as um you know progressive ideas about humanity, and both of those things are tenets within their discourse. And the reason why I say Sam Harris is a eugenicist is because of the way that he ended up landing on the IQ question. And within the that confines, the things that he was talking about with Charles Murray were clearly within the intellectual tradition of eugenicism, which
How so?
dates back to the early anthropological record. Like if you look at Samuel Morton, or basically Samuel Morton's one of the strongest examples of this. But like there's so many examples of anthropologists of the late 19th and early 20th century extolling these ideas of progressive humanity, with the Northern European being the paradigm of civilization, etc., and say, taking the Darwinistic approach of saying, "Oh, it's the survival of the fittest, and we should ensure that um, only the most apt to survive in our society reproduce, etc., etc."
It doesn't seem
That
to me like Sam Harris is making that argument. And that being said, I think he has a completely uninformed view on the idea of race, as I think you know, because I have like he looks at it from a perspective like I think you and I might have talked before already about how the very idea of race itself doesn't even actually make that much sense anyway.
the idea of race is a complete construct of 20th century pseudoscience,
Yeah.
and it has no veracity within the confines of actual biology. And to use race as a marker to try and analyze anything is a fallacious starting point. And that's why it's in bad faith. Anybody who uses race as a criteria for an evaluation of anything is starting from a bad faith position.
But couldn't they just be misinformed?
They could have, misinformed beliefs, yeah, but there's so much within the the sphere of scholarship that anybody who professes themselves to be an intellectual, holds a PhD, holds a degree from a prestigious university, should know that I don't think allowing them that leeway is necessarily a judicious approach to analyzing the discourse. Because you should look at anytime you analyze somebody's discourse, you have to look at who's speaking. If somebody is a professor at a university and they're taking a position where they're straw manning their opposition and making up artificial positions that this supposed adversary is supposed to hold without understanding the actual positions that their adversary holds, they are in their core taking a bad faith position in their discourse.
Okay. Well, like,
and if somebody has a habit of taking a bad faith position in their discourse, how do you know that the rest of their discourse is in good faith? It's nigh impossible.
Well, it's hard to define. I mean, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying, but it's hard to interpret like why someone does what they do. But
I don't profess.
For example, with the people we're talking about, like
I don't profess to understand their motivations. I'm only analyzing their arguments.
Okay.
And a bad faith argument is one that does not engage their interlocutor in a manner which seeks a greater understanding for both.
See,
it's not analyzing their intentions. I don't care what these people do in their lives. It's the arguments that they make. They could go and fuck kids for all I care. And still be held up by their acolytes as saints as they are. But it is the nature of the arguments that they make that I find to be in bad faith.
Okay.
Meaning that they do not allow for a honest and logical rebuttal or refutation of their claims, because they take a priori notions of the opposition in their arguments that are not real.
Yeah, I see.
That is by definition a bad faith argument.
Okay, but I see the thing that I think though is that they might not necessarily know that they are bad faith arguments, because like they might be so caught up in their ideological way of looking at the world that they're not aware that they're misinformed about this type of thing.
Isn't the impetus on them to do their fucking research?
Yeah, I think so. But for example,
why allow them the leeway to make bad faith arguments?
What's the alternative?
Do your own research.
Well, I can still view the opinions of these people and then do my own research. Like that's where I can get the ideas of other research.
To say somebody says some good things, and to say somebody says I agree with some things that they say and I agree with other things that they say. That's a very nuanced position on its face. But what I hear when you say that is not necessarily that you're looking at the positions as they are. It's more so, I find this person to be a verifiable source of information, and some things that this
particular perspective,
some things that this person says, I find to be useful for me in my ideology and or my personal philosophy, whatever. When I hear that and you say somebody whom I have an extensive knowledge of and know the nature of that person's argument, it leads me to believe that you hold ideas that by their nature do not have either a justification in evidence, do not have a justification within logic, or do not have a justification within a historical analysis.
Okay.
Like when somebody talks about, like, like when somebody talks about political Islam, for example, specifically within this intellectual dark web that we live in as being members of the internet. Whenever somebody is talking about Islam within the context of the intellectual dark web, they're not looking at a historical relationship between Europe and the Near East or the Levant or whatever you want to call that region. They're not looking at the history of the political structures within that region prior to Islam either. They're not looking at the ethnographic data that we have based on that region. So it's a very black and white view that doesn't look at the nuance of the people who actually live there.
I don't agree with the perspective on
and
Islam.
Assigning a ethnocentric idea upon those people. And so much of the discourse within the intellectual dark web is founded within this ethnocentric ideal of the West and progress and what is good and what is bad. It's a fundamentally moralistic claim on what the world is.
Yes. Well, I don't agree with their perspective on Islam.
So what are these things that you agree with?
Well, for example, one thing that I've mentioned that I agree with about Sam Harris is like the value of what he calls spirituality from a secular perspective. Like I like the idea of meditating and stuff like that. And I can go through other examples of him and Jordan Peterson too, but like the reason I pay attention to them at all, and a lot of different people who I pay attention to at all, is because I want to get a particular perspective and then measure it against other perspectives so I can have a lot of different kinds of perspectives. So I can try to avoid getting too attached to one particular perspective and then always kind of learn and figure out my own worldview based on the different options.
That's a much different way of presenting. I agree with some of the things he says, and I disagree with some of the things he says, because that's a more nuanced view that you have just presented.
Yeah, that's what I always try to do.
But what I would say to that is that how you present yourself within the narrative of political or civil discourse is just as important as where you glean your views. By saying, oh, some of the things this person says, who is a notorious bad faith actor, such as Ben Shapiro or Steven Crowder or even Jordan Peterson, is a detriment to you. Because I look at
that just seems like you agree with none of what they say, and you're right and they're wrong. Like I don't agree with most of what they say either.
But that's not what I'm saying. And the reason why that's not what I'm saying is because like there's nothing new under the sun, and there's nothing new as to what any of these people are saying. And attaching the ideas to the people is not necessarily the most beneficial thing to do. Now, when talking about whether or not somebody approaches these ideas in bad faith, it's important to look at what these ideas are and the history therein. When somebody says postmodern neo-Marxist,
it's an oxymoron.
It's an oxymoron, but it has a long historical history. And this is why you go online and look up people who are acolytes of Peterson, and they're talking about the Jewish question, because postmodern neo-Marxism is an analog to cultural Bolshevism, which is a Nazi propaganda piece.
Okay, but
so that's why people look at Jordan Peterson
for what their fans think in response to their ideas. Yes. I don't think so. Why do you think?
Absolutely. So you're gonna say that people who follow a charismatic leader are not the leader is not responsible for the actions of their followers?
Not entirely. In a way, they should be responsible with what they say. But
exactly. They should be responsible in what they say. That's exactly what I'm saying. Their words are what draw these people in. And their words are what inspire people to act in the way that they do.
Yeah, but it seems like it seems like if you start to say that because people pay attention to these people, that because these people are saying things that that are like causing these bad effects, it seems like these people are causing these people to behave in a particular way.
Are they not?
They don't control how those people behave.
So there are several aspects here. Like the degree to which an individual can influence others is always up for debate. But it's undeniable that humans are social, and within the confines of the culture that we live in today, that a charismatic leader can influence a great number of people to act in a certain way by their words alone. Is that a fair statement to make?
Yeah.
So if someone, through their words alone, influences a large number of people to act in a way that is something that I would find aberrant, or something that I would find not necessarily beneficial to people writ large, do I hold the individuals who act responsible with and absolve the person whose words inspired them to act that way? Or do I also hold the speaker, the charismatic leader, responsible for their actions as well?
See,
So if
I
I'm a
think
speaker,
the key word there is what, like, the key phrase there is like what you would define this way and what you would see this way. Like your judgment isn't the same as everyone else's judgment. And like for another
I would
thing,
not claim that.
let's say for the sake of
That's not the
argument that
claim that
I'm
I'm making.
agreeing with.
That's not the claim that I'm making. That's not the claim that I'm making
Well,
at
it
all.
seems like you're making judgments though.
I am making judgments.
Okay, so why are your judgments better than other people's
I'm not
judgments that
saying
might be
that my
different?
judgments are better than other people's judgments. What I'm saying is the logic behind my judgment sound logic?
So other people are less logical than you?
No.
I'm confused then.
What I am doing is presenting a logical argument.
Okay.
You, as somebody who has a logical mind, to evaluate the logic that I'm presenting. Is the logic that I'm presenting as my argument sound logic? Yes or no? If it is sound logic, then it is reasonable to expand my logical thought process to other people. And if other people are taking this same logical thought process that I am taking, then it is reasonable to say that this thought process and this value judgment that I am making can be a commonly held belief within people. And this is the reason why the argument holding what I am arguing to be true can be true.
Okay. So let's say then, for example, that like some like you were saying, some of the things that these people believe these people believe lead to their followers doing or saying particular things in response to their opinions. It seems like the example you brought up, for example, and often the criticisms of the followers of these people that I hear are based on not actually what people like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson are actually advocating for themselves. It's based on like exaggerations from those points. And if they're exaggerations from those points, then to me, they're a slippery slope arguments. And I don't really buy slippery slope arguments for the most part.
Slippery slopes are fallacies. But then we have to look at the nature of the arguments themselves. And when these arguments presented, are they as nuanced or banal as you would think? Like when Jordan Peterson talks about, if a woman shows up wearing makeup to a workplace, she is inviting sexual harassment.
I don't think he says that exactly.
It's a paraphrase, but in the Vice interview, he said something to that effect.
I think he said something like that they're inevitably going to cause people to look at them sexually or something like that.
Okay,
I don't
so
know the
when
exact
somebody
quote.
uses the word inevitable, what they're saying is that they do it with their, like, if it's inevitable that if I walk out into the street, I will get hit by a car, and I still walk out into the street knowing the inevitability, I walked out into the street to get hit by a car.
Yeah.
So if somebody, knowing the inevitability of their sexuality, puts on makeup and gets harassed, then they put on the makeup knowing that they would get harassed.
Okay. Do you think
in the same way?
Are you saying that Jordan Peterson has that opinion, or that his opinion can lead to that opinion?
He has explicitly said that if an individual basically adorns themselves in an overtly sexual manner, then it is expected that sexual advances will be made on them by other people within their environment.
Yeah.
Meaning that with that knowledge, anybody who puts on an adornment which makes them overtly sexual is inviting sexual advances upon themselves.
Okay.
Just as I walking into the street, knowing that it is extremely likely or probable that I will get hit by a car, am inviting that phenomena to occur.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, that's one particular position that's
his position. It's not that I'm saying it's one particular position. I'm saying it's not up for agreement or disagreement. This is what he said.
I know.
This is what he said. Now,
what I was gonna say is that one particular position of his that I don't particularly agree with. Although, like, it depends. It depends on the woman we're talking about. I know you're talking about his opinion. I'm telling you my opinion of his opinion.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm saying like, I personally mostly don't agree with that perspective, particularly because, perhaps like you, I don't like to look at anything as inevitably for that particular reason. But it could depend on the person too. Like, maybe some women do that deliberately, and obviously a lot of women don't. So obviously it's a lot more complex than that.
There's some aspects within that we can delve upon, but within the context of what I'm talking about, within what Peterson is doing, right? So Peterson holds this position. Now, an acolyte of Peterson, let's say it's a male, sees somebody who adorns themselves in a sexual manner in their workplace and then makes sexual advances upon them, whether they be welcomed or not, would use that as a priori justification for their behavior. And within their intellectual sphere, they have a justification for their behavior.
Oh, you mean like someone could justify sexual harassment based on what Jordan Peterson said about makeup?
In the act, yes. Whether or not it holds up to scrutiny is not the point. Like, dealing with things after the fact is easy. dealing with things before the fact is difficult, and that's the problem with things such as crime prevention, etc. Like, you can't prevent crime, you can't prevent offenses, you can't prevent this, that, or the other, because human nature is such that people will act in the moment, not even necessarily in their own interest, but based on their predilections at the time, right? So if but and this is a big but, people's predilections are dictated by the confluence of their experience. So this gets back to the John Haidt rider and elephant metaphor, right? Like, the better you train your rider, the more adequately he can ride the elephant.
Yeah.
So if your rider is tuned into these methods or ideas of how to deal with people that aren't necessarily reflective of how your culture accepts this behavior, then you're automatically going to drive your elephant off a cliff. And that's going to that's going to get somebody in trouble. And it's going to get somebody in trouble, and it's going to really hurt somebody. Like, say you're working in an office, and you really take to heart the ideas of Peterson, including this one, and you use this as a justification to hit on somebody who works in your office who doesn't want you to do that. 1 time is all right. 2 times, it's kind of weird. 3 times, it's not okay. 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, 7 times. This is what a lot of people deal with. And using the justification that, oh, somebody adorned themselves in a sexual manner to justify that behavior is automatically going to leave you in a position where somebody is going to be aggrieved and somebody is going to be not acting within their best interests.
Okay.
Based on the ideas that were presented by this thought leader.
Okay. Yeah, well,
So
I mean, I
to what
agree
extent do you hold the thought leader accountable for the ideas that he's presenting? If the idea is bad and it's reflected in bad behavior within society, do you not hold the thought leader responsible for that idea?
See, I don't think that idea has to lead to that outcome, though. Like, even necessarily
I
with the
agree.
majority of people or the majority of the time.
I agree. We're not working with majorities. We're working with outliers. Because the majority of people act normally and have enough social acumen to address themselves within culture in a, proprietous way. However, the question is of outliers. If somebody as an outlier is inspired by somebody else, to what extent is that somebody else to be held accountable? And I'm not saying like criminally accountable or like, accountable in a manner that is detrimental to their livelihood, etc., but accountable intellectually.
Okay.
So if somebody like Marx is held accountable for the ideas of Marxists, if your name spawns a movement, you should be held accountable for the acolytes of your movement.
Like I'm just thinking, like, what ideas could it possibly make any sense to pay attention to? Like, how much of a small percentage of people offer views that are so nuanced that if you give them the least
It's not the nuanced
possible interpretation, that none of their opinions will lead to these sorts of outcomes.
It's not the nuanced views
outliers doing these bad things.
It's not the nuanced views that are the problem. It's the polemic views that are the problem.
That's what I'm saying. Like, like what I was saying earlier, for example, like it's not necessarily the case that I can find nuanced views from all the particular perspectives that I want to get them from. Like if I only look for nuanced views on every particular subject, then I might not find it for particular worldviews within that subject. Do you see what I mean?
I would disagree with that. The I think holding people accountable intellectually is important, just as important as holding yourself accountable for your own intellectual musings is important. So
I agree that it's important. I'm just not sure I agree that it's as important as you think it is.
I think it's paramount, honestly, because if you're not evaluating people based on the quality of their arguments, how else will you evaluate the thinker that you're listening to? And
Well, I think like
and
how
this
they
is my
behave
own
as a
methodology.
person
Well,
towards other people is
well, no,
important
this is
too,
my
though.
own methodology. This is my own methodology for evaluating views.
Okay.
Because if I'm going to spend my time looking at something, it better be worth my time. Because time, like, we can get into an economic argument about what stems value, but like I hold fast to a time theory of value. Like the only thing that is of value that humans can trade is time, and anything that people trade for whatever is a function of time. So like anytime I pay somebody for medicine, that's for more time myself, that I'm not in pain or, you know,
Yeah.
in psychosis or this, that, or the other, or in cancer or dying. You're paying for time, and people pay you for time if you go to work. They're not paying you for your labor as it is. They're paying for your time laboring. Um, so with a time theory of labor, then why would I spend my time delving into the ideas of somebody whose arguments are known to be spurious, or somebody who does not necessarily have a useful approach to the world?
Okay. Well, with all that being said, uh like seriously, if you can like send me a message of a list or of something of alternatives to the people who I pay attention to, who you think are like more simplistic versions, and you know of more nuanced versions within their worldview, and you like make suggestions to me of like articles or podcasts or books to read or something, and I view them and I'm convinced that they're more nuanced, then I will pay more attention to them if I appreciate them
I'm
more
not
from an economic standpoint, in terms of like using my time, like you were
well,
saying, like if it's
I'm
more
not trying to
valuable to pay attention to them from my perspective too, then I will be more likely to pay attention to someone who I think is more useful to spend my time
Andrew,
with.
I think one of the things that people find difficulty with within the way that I talk is that I'm not trying to convince you of anything.
It
I'm
seems
really
like you're
not.
trying to convince me to not pay attention to these
No, no,
people.
no, no. I'm not. You could do whatever
Okay.
the fuck you want to do. I'm just saying why I think that what you do is not necessarily in your best interests.
Okay.
Because if you want to learn about,
But you seem to agree that I'm not negatively impacted by their opinions, though.
I don't know you well enough to understand what is good and what is bad about you. And that's the core of the issue, is that like my knowledge of you is so superficial that I can't make a judgment as to whether or not I I find you a valuable person that I would want in my life. And to me, that's all that matters. Like, I find you to be an interesting individual with whom I could have an interesting conversation with. And that is the extent to which I find you to be an interesting person. Aside from that, I don't really care. Like,
Okay.
This is one of the things that people find quite obtuse about me, is that I don't really care about people in general.
So I think
Like, I don't give a fuck whether or not, you go and light a Canadian flag on fire tomorrow and like go run naked through the streets of Vancouver. I don't care if you do that.
See, I try to actually like operate in the world in a similar way. Like I might argue against or
but here's the crux. Here's the crux for me.
Criticism of yourself for a second there. I think I was confused by your language and the way you were saying things that you were advocating for. Like
I'm not an advocate of anything except for people fucking getting as much pussy and drinking as much booze as they want in their life. Like, why would you live for anything else except for getting pussy and drinking booze? Really? And getting high sometimes if you want to. Yeah. Like, life is short. We're all going to die. Fucking enjoy it while you're here. That's all I give a shit about for my own self. So why would I advocate for anything else for anybody else? That's the core of it. And like, but at the same time, like, if you want to live your life in the best way possible, you should really try and pare down the amount of information that you get from individuals who are, by the nature of their arguments, wasting your time. And Ben Shapiro, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, et al. Are all fucking wasted time. So far as I'm concerned,
it still seems.
And now I'm not going to say
their opinions, though.
Now, I'm not going to say that I don't spend a lot of time wasting away fucking hate tweeting about bullshit fucking claims that they make. Because about 98.99% of what they write or say is bullshit. Like, the majority of the shit that they say is flat bullshit. And the stuff that is verifiable or has veracity is not unique to them.
Okay. So that's like, why not get the stuff that is verifiable and has veracity if you don't know of other places to get that from?
Because I have other sources.
Okay.
Well, because I have the internet and I have Dr. Google.
I don't have the same sources that you know about. That's what I was saying earlier.
Well, like, for instance, like, we could bring up postmodernism.
Okay.
If you want to understand, like,
when
a postmodern historiography, look up Michel Foucault and delve deep in there. Of course. If you want to understand a postmodern linguistic approach to literature, look up Derrida and go from there. If you want to look up a postmodern approach to psychology, look up Jacques Lacan and go from there. Like, if you want to understand physics, look up actual physicists. If you want to understand the way that the world is, try and discern it from a confluence of verifiable sources, and verifiable sources usually are easy to find. And then you can evaluate the claims that they make based on the confluence of knowledge that you build within your compendium.
How do you spell that guy's name? Jack Lacan or
Lacan? Lacan.
Lecan. Okay.
Mm-hmm. If you just look up his last name, you'll find him. He's a French guy who's dead. So, like, the only shit that I read is of people who are dead anyway. So, like,
okay, yeah. Well, like I said, like learning about people like Derrida and Foucault is what changed my mind completely. One of the main things, in conjunction with hearing about what people like James Sullivan and Thaddeus Russell have explained about it too, is why I completely changed my position on postmodernism, because I learned that, like, this.
Well, the irony of of the whole claims about postmodernism is that they're deeply, like, what people understand to be postmodern is actually deeply existential in its core. And like, you should read more Sartre, and you should read more Camus, and you should read more Heidegger and Kierkegaard and all that shit. Like, get a good philosophical basis if we're going to talk about philosophy. And it's so hard to talk about these things if people don't look backwards and try to understand the past before they try and expound upon the future or the present. Because like, there's nothing new. There's nothing new. Like, anything that Jordan Peterson is saying about treat yourself as you want to be, it's all fucking ripped from Heidegger and Sartre. And he hates continental philosophers unless they're German, because he's
or Russian.
Tsarists. The white Russians. He loves the white Russians, hates the reds.
Yeah.
People say he loves 1950s morality. No, he's a 1920s and 30s guy.
How so?
Because if read the stuff of the post-Great War, like writers, the novelists, and the philosophers, and it's like completely ripped from there, because it's all post-apocalyptic. That's where the post-apocalyptic stuff started, is after the Great War, because the Great War was so traumatic that people started writing novels like fuck, when did Kafka is post World War II, right?
I think so.
No. He's
earlier. How early?
He died in 1924.
Oh wow. Okay.
So when did Metamorphosis come out? Well, like, there's so much work between 1918 and 1939 that is indicative of all these things that we talk about today. That after 1945 kind of got reimagined in a way that put it in different terms. Because prior to the Great War, everything was in terms of monarchy versus the common people. And after the war, it was in terms of communism versus capitalism, which isn't necessarily a useful way to view the world. Because even in the United States prior to the Great War, there were socialistic aspects of society. And like, universal healthcare in Germany was a product of Otto von Bismarck, who was a staunch monarchist. So like, our understanding of how society should be structured is totally colored by the Cold War in a way that is a detriment to our real ability to evaluate these things as they are. They're so ideologically entwined. Anyway, I don't know. We went off on a bunch of tangents, and I'm sorry for that.
That's okay. No, this was all really, really fascinating. Even when, like you said, you were being a dick to me, I appreciate your honest criticism. Seriously.
I'm always a dick.
But yeah, no, like you said, it's all very important to learn about all of this in context. And that's why I always am endlessly trying to learn more and more, but it's never enough, and it never will be enough, which is actually a good thing in a way, because learning is
I'm gonna
awesome.
assign you some homework.
Okay, please do.
I need you to read the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Oh yeah, that's one you recommended before, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah. Before we talk next time, you need to read that book.
Okay.
And the second piece of homework that I'll assign is you read Slaughterhouse-Five?
Yeah, I think so.
Then I'm gonna assign you Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck.
Oh, cool. And another one that you recommended to me that I still haven't read, but should take like no time at all to read anyway, is Frankenstein.
Yes. All these things are important, sir. On that note, I think we should.
Suggestion? Okay. You can tell me anytime.
I'm tired.
All right.
I want to go to sleep. It's almost midnight.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks a lot for talking, man. This was lots of fun, as always. And yeah, I hope we can talk again, and I'll read those books before the next time we talk too. And yeah, thanks so much. And I think the most important points that you mentioned, I think, are, and that I think about often too, are, learn more, learn and read more. Learning and reading are awesome, and also enjoy life. So yeah, I'll just say all the stuff I like to say at the end of my videos here, and then you can give any plugs of yours if you want to. I'll add your
plugs.
No?
No.
All right. All right. All right. So thanks everyone so much for watching another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and hopefully Isaiah did too. And as I like to always say, thank you so much for everyone who's subscribed to my channel. Thank you so much for everyone who's contributed to me on Patreon. Thank you so much for anyone else who subscribes to my channel or contributes to me on Patreon too. And as I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this, that the funk cures all. All right, so keep having mindgasms, everyone. And any last words there, Isaiah?
Get fucked.
Yeah, get fucked.
In the best way.
Yes. Go get laid. All right. Adios until next time, everyone.